Good to see you. I guess I caught you off guard with my sneeze real quick there, but good to see you. Yeah, so data modeling is dead. Long live data modeling. If you're here for this, then this is what you're in for. A little bit about me. I wrote a book called Fundamentals of Data Engineering. Who's heard of this book? Anyone heard about it? A lot of people? Who's read it? Cool, that's fine. If you haven't read it, go read it. I am a recovering data scientist. I think the last guy who was up here too seemed like one of those. So anyway, get to it. Some motivations for this talk, right? So after writing Fundamentals of Data Engineering, I felt like it was specifically chapter 8 on queries, transformations, and data modeling. I didn't really do the subject of data modeling justice. I think I gave you what you needed to know as a data engineer, but that was like the bare minimum. And so I started getting a lot of questions from people, like, why didn't you cover this, or why didn't you cover that? So it became this game of whataboutism about what was missing and how stupid I am for missing things. And I take things very personally, and I'm very fragile, typical American, fragile egg, low self-esteem. And so, I'm just joking actually, but I kept seeing the same problems of data modeling occurring in my own business. I run a consultancy. And I would say a lot, especially with a quote modern data stack, there have been a lot of issues which we'll talk about. But these in data modeling, these issues create huge and expensive problems. Who's seen this? Okay, well, stick around. We'll talk more about this. But as I'll talk about in a second, I feel like if we ignore data modeling any further, the consequences are going to be severe. So let's talk about why that is and why now. So whose company is trying to do AI right now? Few people? Who's heard of AI? Okay. Anyway, it's hot again for like the 50,000th time. I feel like this time is a bit different though. ChatGPT is really, it's caught the public's attention. My kids use it all the time, for example. You could argue AI has been around and ML has been around forever in some manifestation or another. If you use a smartphone, for example, congratulations, you've been using ML-powered apps for a long time. So the rise of AI also means like there's new attention on data right now, right? But corporate data sets in companies, these are overwhelmingly a giant disaster. Who would want to disagree with me on this? I'll be waiting. You can find me after if you feel like it. So the big question is if we're not going to get data right as an industry right now, what I'm talking about is all the stuff we've been crying about for ages: data governance, data management, data quality, all of this stuff, right? Getting data right, adding value to the business. Who's heard this old trope, right? Right. So if we're not going to do it now when all the attention in the universe is being paid to us, and we could arguably get a lot of money for these initiatives, and then when are we ever going to do this as an industry, right? Like, when are we going to get this right? So I feel like this is our moment to shine, and data modeling is key to this. So we'll discuss what's a data model, why data modeling is dead, and why it's also alive. It's kind of like a zombie. So what's a data model? Let me just take about a minute here and maybe just ask somebody in the audience if they want to take a crack at defining a data model. Cool. What's that? Kimball? That's a form of modeling for sure. Let's see what maybe some old school references say. So this is from a book called Data and Reality by William Kent. It was written in 1978. This was about the time when I think people were trying to become more cognitive. Computers were still pretty new back then, to be honest. And so this book was the first attempt I'd seen at data modeling in a thoughtful manner. So William Kent, if you're a data professional, I would say just get this book and read it. It's fantastic. But what he talks about really is, when modeling reality, right? You can just read these quotes. I'm not going to read them to you. I'll give you about a minute. So again, this is 1978, right? But I think people were trying to figure out, like, how do you shape reality to fit into data back then, right? So you fast forward a bit to this other one from, Steve Hoberman, who I argue is one of the OGs of the data modeling world. I think he was teaching data modeling back in the early 90s. This is what he says about it. So it's a wayfinding tool, right? Notice, though, he's not talking about any particular technique, database, approach, anything like that, right? This is simply a way of taking the reality of your business and applying it to data. Here's my definition. I'm writing a new book on this. It'll be out, I believe, Q1, if everything goes to plan. But here's how I define it so far. This is my working definition. A data model organizes and standardizes data to facilitate believable and useful information and knowledge for humans and machines. Right? I had to add the machines part in case I get cognizant and you want to have that out. But notice I didn't say anything about structuring your data, in this way or that. I noticed I didn't say correct. I used the word believable. Who feels their information is 100%? Who feels their data is 100% correct at their company? Who feels it's at least believable if somebody sees it? Right? And that's why when I talked to, I got this notion from Bill Inman. He's become my one of my key mentors, and he's a really good friend of mine. He's the guy who created the data warehouse and all that stuff. And so I asked him one day, Bill, what's your North Star? You've been in this industry for a long time. I could argue you helped invent the data industry. What keeps you going, right? And he said there's a couple things. It's first believable data, and then it's making that data useful. That's it. That's the punchline. So if you can manage to do those two things, I think you'll be all right. So let's talk about why data modeling is dead. I think there's a few things. Here's some examples here. Who's heard of DBT? A lot of people. Who sees 1,000 plus DBT models for your data team, or something approaching a number that's disproportionate to the size of your data team? Happens a lot? Yeah, it does. I'm not going to fault DBT for this. I will get into this in a bit. But this is a common symptom, right? I think in a podcast I did with Tristan Handy, the CEO of DBT, he mentioned there were 39,000 DBT models in one company, which is insane. I don't know how, if that were your number of children, I don't know how you would know their names or who they are. But even with 1,000 kids, it's a lot. So DBT models everywhere. Another symptom is ad hoc and reactive, what I call query-driven modeling. So a business user comes to you and says, hey, I need you to get me some numbers on this question here. And you do that, and that becomes a query, which is a form of model, which we'll talk about. And then this keeps repeating itself. Who does this? Nobody? Nobody does this? Okay. Well, so fine. Who's seen this quote, WTF does this data mean in your company? Yeah? Okay. And so we're reinventing the wheel a ton, right? I think that it's interesting when I lurk on Reddit and places like that, because I'm kind of masochist. It's interesting when we see the data modeling approaches and sort of how we're going back to Kimball now. We're going back to all these approaches. But as I'll argue, the world's changed a lot since Kimball. Kimball came out in 1996, for example, right? That's a full-grown adult with kids at this point. And meanwhile, you've had a lot of evolution along the way. So let's get back to the basics of data modeling. There's conceptual, which is a high level. There's just thinking about the data. It's technology agnostic. There's logical, which is translating the conceptual to a structure that you can fit into whatever system you want. And finally, there's physical, right? So this is finally the physical implementation, as it would imply. But all too often, right? Data modeling, we start and end with the physical data modeling, right? We get data and we're like, oh, this will fit into this type of a database. So let's just put it there. The problem with this is we have no idea what the hell we're doing. We have no idea what data we put in there. We have sort of an idea. We haven't thought through how that data relates to all the other data in our organization. So this keeps compounding on itself, right? But this is something I see unanimously around the world is, I model my data. I put it into, cloud data platform X, Y, or Z. Not naming names. But that's sort of what people feel like data modeling is. Or like my coach, she was saying, she's also a data scientist. She's like, yeah, I'm doing some data modeling today. And I was like, when you say that, what do you mean? And she's like, well, I'm doing some DBT models, right? So as we'll talk about in a bit, the word model is a bit overloaded too. Models are everywhere. These are like lots of different manifestations of the word model. You have machine learning models. Who works in machine learning? Right, so one person? Oh, well, the one person over here who makes machine learning models. But then there's relational models who ever built a relational model before, right? So yeah, a lot of people familiar. You have object models, right? You have nested data like JSON and star schemas and one big table and streaming events and schema on read and blah, 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 blah. All these are models. And I think part of the problem is the word model is overloaded, but hey, it is what it is. So as I will often say, a lack of a model is still a model. It's just a very crappy model. So just because you're not efficient, I would say thoughtfully modeling data, you actually are. You're trying to represent the reality of your business. You're just doing it in probably a pretty shite fashion. So not saying you're shite, just the way you're doing it. Right? So, yeah. The trends aren't looking good though for data modeling, right? So if we look at the term data modeling in Google, this it was doing better back in the day. I guess as of June of 2022, end of June. I don't think it's ticked up then. So if we look at so some of the old household names like relational data modeling, dimensional data modeling, these aren't doing too hot either, right? So we got a problem. So what happened? I have a few ideas. I think Agile, a lot of that's to blame. Who practices Agile at their company? Who feels like they actually practice Agile? There's a lot of snickering. So, I mean, I think Agile has become sort of its own meme in a way, and so it often means we need to do things really quickly in sprints is what I think it's translated to for a lot of people. So, if you're given 2 weeks to get something done, how do you have time to really think through a problem, like how things relate to each other, for example, right? Data is very much a thinking person's sport. Right, this is, I think, where it differs from other disciplines. You really need to think through the relationships of your business processes and the vocabulary and the definitions and how they relate to each other, then translate that to data. But Agile, I see data teams trying to do Agile, and then what I see them is they're very much in reaction mode all the time. You have no time to get up and breathe and think. We're all smart here, right? So how do you feel if you're constantly just running in 2-week sprints? I think you answered your question with your subtle laughter there, right? So. On the spectrum of fast and formal, fast won as a result, right? We do things quick, we don't do things formally, and that's what happened. I think working with data it's almost too easy. There's no shortage of tools at this point. I wrote a blog post about this a couple weeks ago, but it's like there's no shortage of tools. But I think the title is No Shortage of Tools, but No Idea How to Use Them. And it's true. And meanwhile, data has exploded, right? So you have different formats, tools, and also the world's moved beyond rows and columns, right? We have semi-structured data. We have tons of unstructured data. That's why AI is taking off again. Text, audio, video, and so forth, right? So it doesn't help that there's been a lot of hype with data. Data is the new oil. That was 2014 or something like that. Data science is the sexy job of the 21st century. That was long time ago, and so forth. And then there's the dev and data divide. Let's talk about that. So does this resonate with you? Who works in a dev team? Who works in a data team? Do you feel like this is your experience when you work with the dev team? Does anyone not feel this in their job? So this is a reality, right? Dev makes data, they give it to you, the data team. And it's your job to do data stuff. You also get to wrangle often giant turds, but hey, that's why you make the big bucks. So I'll actually argue that a lot of data modeling issues are the result of like poor practices on the left, right? Because the best you can do after you get data is deal with it, right? But you're not responsible for it. So I would argue actually the symptoms are much, much worse, and the problems are much, much worse at the source. So what are the consequences? Well, we have fragmentation, balkanization of data across the data lifecycle. Data loses accuracy, coherence, believability. I wore this t-shirt for a reason, because it's like the rise of AI also means the rise of bullshit. mass hallucinations with AI models. This will happen. And when you set AI models on top of your corporate data sets, I mean, they hallucinate on a great day, right? So you can imagine what happens when you throw an LLM on top of your corporate data set, and it'll just give you all kinds of crazy answers. But, we're an AI company, so F it. So we hobble along and treat the symptoms. So long-lived data modeling. Kind of run through this. I want to get to some questions here. But so make data modeling a core practice. Bring conceptual logical modeling back. Patterns. Model across the data lifecycle. Stupid wars and what I call mixed model art. So let's get into this. Make data modeling a core practice. I think we need to bring it back. Again, this is our time to shine. I think data modeling is very key to this. If we can't, I shudder to think what's going to happen. So I think just being aware that it's important is a good first step. Being aware of what data modeling is and is not is also a good first step. But as a team, start instituting, just conversations about data modeling. That's the first step. Just be aware of it. It'll become a core practice later, once you're talking about it. Conceptual and logical modeling, I think, have entirely disappeared for most companies, right? Again, we physically implement data, often at the expense of knowing what the hell we're trying to do with it in the first place. I see this around the world. I'm not hallucinating, unlike this ChatGPT. So I think conceptual and logical modeling need to be brought back. How would you bring back conceptual modeling, for example? Well, there's the use of patterns. There are actually, I feel like when I was researching my book, I came across the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was finding all these old books on data model patterns from the 90s and the early 2000s, some of which were written by Australians. I think Australians, a lot of the thought leaders in data modeling are the best out there, period. Guys like John Giles and Graham Simpson and so forth. But they wrote these books on patterns, right? So how do you think about what a retail business is or a manufacturer, for example? It lays it out. The model. It's all there. I would urge you to go back and look at these. Really good resources, the data model resource books, volume 1 through 3. If we could resurrect those and modernize them, that'd be so cool. But this will save you a ton of time and just getting your data models up to speed instead of reinventing the wheel. Model across the data lifecycle. So as I talked about, the tendency is to model sort of myopically, right? We model as data people, our focus is on one big table, Kimball, yada, 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 right? I think that now software engineers, right, they model data according to however the hell they want to do it. It used to be relational, now it's just throw it into some NoSQL database and hope to God it makes any sense. But you got to think about data as a continuum, right? When it's created and it's transformed throughout its various use cases, right? Each transformation, each way it's queried, that's a different model. That's a different way of representing that data. And so you really do need to view data holistically across the life cycle. I think, again, this continuum needs to stop and really we need to shift left and right. The rise of things like data products, data flowing back into the application, for example. This is becoming a bigger trend. I think that you're going to see the divide between dev and data will shrink ultimately. I think another forcing function of this is streaming data. Because we live in a batch-oriented world, dev teams can just lob data over to you and forget about it. But when there's streams, for example, and there's a feedback loop that goes back to the dev team, I truly believe that this gap will drop. Also, like things like data contracts and so forth will go a long way, what Chad was talking about earlier. Stop the stupid and petty infighting in the data modeling world. I noticed there's definitely camps out there that are quite vicious, especially in the old days. It's not helping anybody at this point. I figure data modeling is basically on its last leg, so it's either we stop the fighting and get on board and promote it, or just leave it to the dustbin of history. And I wrote an article about this. Like, what if we just burn it all down? What if we just take all the data modeling stuff that's been written, that we've been taught, and we just throw it out the window, right? Do that thought experiment. It's really fascinating. I could see a scenario where we've kind of already done that, right? And you can see the consequences of it. But I think part of it is the religious infighting that causes some of this. I finally practiced about mixed model arts. So who's heard of mixed martial arts, or like UFC or ONE or whatever? Awesome, a lot of cool people here. It's awesome. So, I mean, there's no one true way, right? You have to embrace many approaches and apply them where they work. This is Bruce Lee, who I consider the founder of mixed martial arts. He came up with a Jeet Kune Do back in the 70s, where he's trying to incorporate various martial arts styles, right? And I think you can learn a lot from this. You can be highly effective as a team. But again, it's about stopping the religious wars. It's about like embracing all the different aspects of data modeling across the life cycle, knowing when to use what the trade-offs are, and so forth. Hopefully nobody's grossed out by the blood on the screen there, but it's Bruce Lee. He's cool. So, yeah, in conclusion, we're at a critical point in our industry. Data modeling is key to making data and AI work. I would argue that without good data modeling, AI is actually not going to work at all in a corporate setting. Use what we've got and also innovate for the future. And finally, recognize you can be part of the change, every one of you, right? This is the time to shine. So with that, I am open to some questions. You might have some. You can also add me on LinkedIn if you'd like. You can go to my Substack there. And yep.
Any questions for Mr. Reis?
You said you were writing a book on data modeling.
Wait, sorry?
Are you writing a new book on data modeling?
Yeah.
Are you going to approach a new data modeling methodology, or are you going to suggest a new data modeling methodology in your book?
Yeah, there will be some new approaches. I feel like the world of data modeling is really was stunted. A place of data probably 2000 was, I think, the last big innovation in data modeling. That was Data Vault, at least when it was published. It came out in the 90s. But since then, you've had a lot of new approaches, new technologies, new ways of doing stuff, right? Machine learning, for example, wasn't really a thing back then. Streaming data, NoSQL and stuff. So I think helping people learn how to model data for those scenarios, right? Is I think key. So yeah, as well as embracing stuff from the past as well, right? So things like relational, right? That's math. That's set theory. So just understanding what's old and what's new is the goal of it. Yep. Other questions?
Anyone else?
Hey, Joe.
Hi.
One of the consistent themes that I see in a lot of the consulting work that I do is many organisations they've been marketed to so heavily by a lot of vendors, no names mentioned, about how they don't need to worry about data modelling anymore. And because they think they're adopting an agile approach, whether they are or they aren't, different matter. How do we get them to see the value of data modeling? Because it's something that I face pretty much every day, where the response typically from inside the organisation is, our vendors have told us we don't need to worry about a data model. We can just throw the data into the lake. We can do all this stuff. We don't need to think about it because the tech will solve the problem. And it's very hard when you're coming from a lot of years of experience like I am to say, this is valuable, this is useful, this will save you years of work and rework.
Yeah.
To sell that to an organization.
I mean, it's really tough, right? I mean, you probably feel like you're pushing on a string sometimes. So, and I think it really is an education issue. I wrote in another blog post, I feel like the biggest issue we have as an industry right now is education. It's not tools. Every vendor has a great tool. Every open source project is freaking awesome. You can solve any problem you want right now. I think it's like rediscovering the practices and the trade-offs of various practices that are going to get us there. And I think it's largely an education issue, which is one of the reasons I'm working on the book, right? But for you, it's a tricky situation because like vendors, love the vendors here, by the way. You're awesome, very cool people. But it is one of those things where their motivation is to what? Bingo. And so there's. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I don't have a good answer. I would say by educating people, though, is probably the only way it's going to get solved, but that's also hard. But that's kind of where we are. We let it go for so long now. It's like you're going to have to hit the treadmill and eat well. That's kind of what it comes down to. So how are we doing on time?
Yeah, we got time for one more. There was a hand here somewhere, I thought.
How do they justify the statement that the product or the tool will solve having no data modeling? How did?
Wait, say that?
So you're saying a lot of vendors say that data modeling is no longer important. What's their argument? How do they justify that statement?
I mean, I have to ask the vendors individually, of course.
No, fair enough.
I can't speak for the vendor industry, which are none. I think a lot of it is, it's always the easy button, right? Like we make it so easy to do stuff that you don't need to think about it, including your data, right? It's only the most important ingredient you have. So I kind of equivocate it to if I'm selling you a nice gas stove or a nice oven, right? Does that make you a good cook? Right. I think that's how tools are sold, though. It's like you don't need to know shit about how to mix ingredients together anymore. You don't need to know flavor profiles or anything. It's like, hey, you got like a $7,000 gas oven at your house. You should be able to cook anything, right? So I mean that's how I feel this conversation usually go. So at the end of the day, the data is the ingredients, and your ability to model and think about the data is your ability to be a cook in that analogy, right? But lots of cool ovens out there. Air fryers too. I like air fryers. So, awesome.
All right,
Good work for time.
that's all we got time for. Thanks very much, Joe.